Okay. Hi, everyone. Happy Sunday. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Megan Stevenson Krause. I'm a board member of 3G Philly. And if you don't already know, 3G Philly is a nonprofit in the Philadelphia area for grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. And a big part of our commitment is to tell our grandparents' stories and make sure that they continue to be heard both in the classroom and beyond, and to support Holocaust education. So I'm really thrilled to be here this Sunday afternoon and have you all spending this afternoon with us with Lilly Maier. Um, she's gonna tell her story, so I don't want to like steal that from her, but it's really incredible. And for me, it was particularly special that Lilly reached out to us because her story is rooted in Vienna, and that is where my grandparents were from. So, Lilly, if you'd like to take it from there.
Yes, thank you. Happy Hanukkah, everyone. I'm also excited to be with you. So we decided that I'm just gonna talk for about 10 minutes, maybe 12. I didn't time it, and then we'll start a discussion from there. But I want to tell you a little bit before we get into discussion, and let me share my screen. I recently published in English this book called Arthur and Lilly. I originally wrote it in German 5 years ago, but it last month came out in English. And it is about a Holocaust survivor named Arthur and me, Lily. And we both met through a total coincidence because we both grew up in the same apartment in Vienna, in Austria, in this house here on the second floor. Arthur spent his childhood there in the 1930s, and I spent my childhood there in the 1990s. So 60 years apart, we grew up in the same apartment, totally coincidentally. And I met him 20 years ago when I was 11 and looked much cuter than now. Because he, living in California and Los Angeles at the time, he had this strong desire to see his old apartment again, as maybe like some of your grandparents did as well. I think it's very emotional, especially if you're like Arthur and you're the only survivor of your family. So this apartment kind of became the last place that he had felt a close connection to them. And because Vienna wasn't bombed as much, like these turn of the century houses, they look pretty much the same. So this is how I first got to meet him. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more at the end of how both of our lives were influenced by that in quite a strong way, I would say. But let me maybe first tell you a little bit about him. So he was saved on a kinder transport to France, actually. So probably, since this is a 3G meeting, you know what the kinder transport is. Just to recap, I mean, it is really the largest rescue operation during the Holocaust. And it is 15,000 Jewish children that could be saved because their parents were willing to separate from these children and to send them away by themselves. And most people have only ever heard of the kinder transport to England, because it is 10,000 children. It is the largest, of course. But there were also kinder transports to France, to Sweden, to Switzerland, Belgium, like a number of countries. And so the form you see here, it's his application form to sign him up for kinder transport to France. And he also, I mean, if you know French, I cannot speak anymore. If you know French, you might notice that he's not called Arthur at the time. He's actually born Oswald and only became an Arthur in America. So this is his application form. And then another big difference to the British kinder transport is that in Britain, the majority of the children were sent to foster care. But in France, all of them lived together in refugee children's houses. So these were specially opened refugee children houses for Jewish children from Germany and from Austria. And so the idea behind that is that it's going to be less traumatic and less isolating for these children to keep together, to keep speaking German, to be among peers going through the same thing, than it is to send them to a foster family. which is now what we believe. Like when we work with like unaccompanied minors. Today, usually a group setting is preferred, but at the time, this was very unusual. And I mean, even still today, many people will say a child belongs in a family. But if the family doesn't speak the same language, doesn't have the same religious or cultural background, it can be much more isolating and traumatizing than for these children to stay together. And I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this here would be Oswald, this little boy here. And the man you see, his name is Ernst Papanek. He was the director. And he, I mean, I could talk about him forever. He was such a like progressive, revolutionary teacher. He did so many things to help the children cope with their trauma and with their mental health. He always cared more about mental health than about spelling. So he actually sent the children to therapy. If you ask them today, like as adults or grown 80 and 90-year-olds, they will tell you that there was no therapy because they didn't realize it. It was hidden as games. It was hidden as art therapy. He did a lot of things to teach these children democracy after living in a dictatorship. So he just really did a great job with these children. And we might talk about that later if you want, because you can kind of see a difference then in their mental health when they become adults. But of course, the other big difference to the other Kindertransports is that France was indeed occupied by the Germans largely. So you had to bring the children to safety once again. Here you can see them after the declaration of World War II. You can see one boy is wearing a gas mask here in the middle. And it's during an air raid when they have to go to the basement. So initially they stayed close to Paris, but then they brought them to the south of France, to the unoccupied part of France. But then that wasn't safe either. As you might know, the unoccupied part of France, often called Vichy France, started very actively working together with the Germans and the Nazis. So everyone realized we need to really save these children a second time. And so that's when they organized a second Kindertransport to America. This Kindertransport to America is so unknown. Like I've been to scholarly conferences about the Kindertransport, where people spending their career researching the Kindertransport try to tell me there is not one to America. There is, it's happening in 1941, and it's from France to America. But it is mostly these refugee children. It is some French kids, some French Jewish children, but it is primarily the Austrian and German refugee children that already came to France. And you can see here Oswald again at the port of Lisbon. So you had to bring the children through Spain, through Portugal to America. And it was very complicated. And if you read like documents, it makes you wonder how it even worked. But it did work. They brought 300 children here to America. And then what happened in America is that they separated the children, because American social workers believe the child belongs in a family, and they also believe they should become American as quickly as possible. So they sent them all over the country, and they didn't tell them each other's addresses. And so for the children, although physically their life was now completely safe, they were in America, this was their trauma, because they had kind of survived the separation from their parents by finding this new family in France, this new community. And this was taken away from them. So that for them was much more traumatic than the original Kindertransport. And in the end, it didn't work. Like once they became adults, they all started looking for each other, and they all found each other again and became very close again. But during their teenage years, they were very alone and felt very alone. And so Oswald, who now became an Arthur, because he just changed his name to sound more American, he was very gifted in mathematics and the sciences. So he got a scholarship. He became an engineer. And you can see him here. He is this young man standing here. And this is an astronaut. So Arthur was actually involved in the moon landing. So it's quite the American dream story. And I mean, this, of course, was a very quick retelling of Arthur, and happy to go into more details in the discussion. But I do want to end by talking briefly about why is this book called Arthur and Lilly? Why is it not just called Arthur? So how was my life influenced by this meeting? So as I showed you before, I was 11 years old. I started studying history as an adult. I became an expert on the Kindertransport. Right now, I'm doing my PhD in Jewish history. And I know everyone always wants to know, so I am not Jewish. So this meeting when I was 11 was my first time knowingly meeting a Jewish person, my first interaction or learning about the Holocaust. And it had this really strong impact on me. But also this, and then one more thing. And that is that my mother signed me up for a student history project. So basically, we knew beforehand that Arthur was going to visit. And I mean, I was 11. I didn't really reflect on this too much. But my mother found it very weird knowing that we lived in an apartment where everyone had been killed, except like the one person who was coming to visit us. And we didn't know Arthur. I mean, he could have had like a nervous breakdown in our living room. Like, you don't know how he's going to react. So she wanted there to be more, to have a little bit more, like, it's not just he comes, he leaves, we never see each other again. So she signed me up for this history project. And as part of this project, Austrian students wrote short biographies of Holocaust victims. So I wrote a short biography of Arthur's mother, Frida. Then he came and he brought like he didn't have many things. He only had like some photos and some letters, but he brought those. He told me about his mother, Frida. So I could write this short biography. Of course, my mother would not have needed to worry because he really was the happiest man I met in my entire life. It was a wonderful meeting. But then I was already in this history project. And now what happens is an incredibly crazy chain of coincidences that starts with the project using me for publicity a lot. Because, you know, cute story, 11-year-old girl living in the same apartment as this Holocaust survivor. And so this newspaper article that you can see here appeared, and you can see me holding this tiny photo of Frida. I mean, this looks big on the screen, but it's a newspaper, a small photo of me, tiny photo of Frida. So the next day, a woman starts calling the newspaper, demanding to speak to my family. And of course, the newspaper doesn't give out our information, but she keeps calling, So in the end, the newspaper calls my mother and says, please, like, this crazy lady keeps calling. No one is getting any work done. Please just talk to her. So my mother calls her, and it turns out that she's not crazy at all. She was actually already 83 years old. And for over 60 years, she had been keeping a package from Arthur's parents. And she recognized the photo of Frida in a newspaper. So in 1941, when the parents were being deported from Vienna to Poland, they packed this package with like passports, insurance documents, just like family documents. And they thought if we somehow make it back from Poland with this package, we can rebuild our lives. And if not, little Oswald is in France and he should get it. And they gave this package to their best friend. But the best friend was half Jewish and was also afraid of being arrested and gave the package to his 18-year-old cousin. And the 18-year-old cousin now is the woman who 60 years later recognized the picture in the newspaper. And I mean, I've told the story so many times, and sometimes I still cannot believe it. And this is the short version. Like, she usually read tabloids, but on this Sunday, she read a serious newspaper. Like, the amount of things that had to happen in the exact perfect order for this woman to see this paper and to be able to return this package to Arthur, who really, he didn't have anything from his parents. So I'm sure, as you can imagine, our friendship became much, much more intense and close than if he really had come one time, left, and we never spoke again. And so he came to Austria a couple more times, and then I started coming to America. And he would introduce me as his Austrian granddaughter. And luckily, you see the other granddaughters in the photos, they did not have a problem with that. So we are still very close to this day. I just spent Thanksgiving with them. And I mean, really, like for Arthur, this friendship brought like a new connection to Austria, to his home. And for me, it brought, well, first of all, this big Jewish family. And then also I became a Holocaust historian. So it really had quite the impact on my life. And I initially wrote this book 5 years ago in German, and it now came out in English. And I've been touring the States. I'm doing 40 readings in like 60 days. So it's been quite intense. And I'm happy I got to tell you a little bit about it. And it was just a short version of it, but we wanted to leave more than enough time for questions and discussion. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Lily. Even though I knew most of that, I still find myself like you said, you've told the story so many times and you still sometimes can't believe it.
It is a crazy story, yeah.
Yeah, it's quite a story. So I'd love to, one of the things I think that really struck me, and I've had this conversation with at least a couple people that I see that are in this room, and also I just want to encourage people, if you are in a place where you can, to open your cameras. Like, we're a small group, this can be very much a group conversation. So one of the things that particularly struck me in reading the book, and as you were telling the story, is actually just the whole interaction of like Arthur coming to, like, how you met in the first place, and Arthur coming to back to his home, right? And I told you this when we were prepping for this. Like, this summer I was in Vienna and I stood in front of the apartment building where my grandfather grew up, and I just couldn't bring myself to like ring the doorbell because I've heard mixed stories.
Yeah. Sometimes I know many stories too, like Arthur had tried in the 70s and they didn't let him in. And so this is why this time around he contacted us beforehand. And so this is why we knew that he was coming. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I've also done it with other survivors. And usually, like, I don't know, if you meet like migrant families, they're usually very excited, and old Viennese families can be more difficult. But I mean, I think the more time passes, the people are more open to it. Definitely. Yeah.
I'm curious to know, you mentioned that your mom had wanted to, give it a little bit more structure. Did you ever have a chance to talk more with her about sort of what was their thinking how did they feel when they received when he reached out, or, like.
Yeah, so I mean, for my mother, it was always clear that she would allow it. But then, as I said, like, then she started thinking, I mean, okay, now we know he's the sole survivor, which means everyone else was killed. And then this history project started right around the same time, because Austria is always very late in coming to terms with its history, so this was in 2003, the first nationwide Holocaust student history project. So it just kind of came together. And this was announced maybe a week or two after Arthur had reached out to us. So then she felt like this would be the perfect opportunity. Of course, the program was not aimed at 11-year-olds, but it was aimed at 14-year-olds when you do it in school. But she signed me up for it. And that's kind of how everything else happened from that meeting and experience. Yeah.
It really does feel like a lot of things had to happen.
Oh, so many things.
Yeah.
I always say I could have called the book 1001 Coincidences. Also, like, people have suggested to me I should write it as a novel because it sells better. And on the one hand, I couldn't do it because it's too close to me, and like I couldn't pretend I made it up. But I also think people wouldn't believe it. Like, if you don't post a picture of the newspaper article, people were like, she's stretching it a bit. Like, this sounds very unrealistic. But in reality, I mean, there's so many of stories like this, especially concerning the Holocaust.
Yeah. Well, and you have a very unique way of writing as well,
Thank you.
almost journalistic.
Yes. I mean, I have a history background and a journalism background, and if I might say so, the book is very easy to read. It is written, yeah, it is written like a novel, but everything in it is true. And I jump around, like I don't. It is mostly Arthur's story. It is mostly the story how Arthur survived the war, but I jump around a lot from how I met him, and I also travel to all the places that he was at as a refugee child. I travel to the children's homes. I travel to the ports where he was, and so I also write about that. And I also write about how I did research for the book and what people I met. So I just kind of take the reader along on finding all this out. And I think this also makes it easier to read. And also a lot of Holocaust books end in 1945, like a lot of them, especially autobiographies. And I mean, these people, they were like very young. Arthur was like 15, and I couldn't just like stop telling his life. And as I mentioned, he really was the happiest man I ever met. And he was so optimistic, but it was a conscious decision for him. Like he just decided, he decided to make peace with his past. He realized that the Nazis didn't even know he was hating them, you know, and the Germans, the Austrians, they didn't know he was hating them. The only person who knew of the hate was himself. And so, of course, the only person suffering from this hate was himself. And so he just decided to stop at like 19 years of age, which is very young and I find very inspiring. But that's all these kind of things that get left out if you stop telling a story in 1945. And I've been to like a lot of synagogues in the last couple of weeks, and I think it's especially the story of how Arthur became a happy man that's been resonating to people with everything terrible happening right now, that there is a way to stay an optimist or become an optimist. So yeah, the book goes till the present, not till 1945. Yeah.
I have a couple questions that you sort of like touched very briefly, but I'd like to dig deeper on. One is just that you mentioned in your presentation about like the difference in the sort of like the trauma and when were those traumatic moments for the children.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, yes, generally, I think when we think about the kinder transport, we definitely think about the kinder transport to the UK. We think about them being placed in families. And so, in your research and even in your conversations with Arthur, I mean, what, like, how do you think that this impacted and sort of differed in terms of the experiences of the children and how they dealt with their trauma in that then, and but also like later in their lives?
Yeah, I mean, actually, like the first study I ever did on the Kindertransport was called Life After the Kindertransport. And it's a study on like what happened to them. And what you can see is that statistically, like almost all of them became very successful professionally. Like you have 15,000 people and 4 Nobel Prizes. And so they really took these last words from their parents, like make something, be a good child, like grow up. It didn't break them, like they took it as a kind of like motivation. So professionally and like financially, almost all of them became very successful, but you do see a big difference in the mental health. As between like not only the French children who had Ernst Papanek, who had such an impact on them, also other children in England that lived in group housings versus the ones that were all alone in foster families. With the foster families, you could be lucky or you couldn't be lucky. But even if you were lucky and had a good family, you were going through everything by yourself and you felt very alone and isolated until the 90s. Really when these survivor generations started coming up, but not before. Whereas the ones that shared this experience together, they also have a lot of happy memories about the war, and they continue these social structures. Like they became the aunts and the uncles for their own children. And I think the biggest difference that I could make out is who told their own children about the Holocaust and at what age. And it's that the ones that were all alone and suffered during the Kindertransport, most of them tried to hide it from their children, and they just never spoke of the Kindertransport or the Holocaust or the war, which created this whole topic that no one ever talked about. And that there was this big silence, the big secret. And that only changed in the 90s when they started speaking publicly about it. Whereas a lot of the kids from France or from group homes in England, because their entire social circle came from the same background, they were very open about it. And so you can actually see like the first movies about the Kindertransport were made by women that didn't know that their mother had been on a Kindertransport until the mother died. And when looking through the papers, they found out about it. And so these second generation had this like almost obsessive urge to find out what happened to their parents, whereas the ones that grew up knowing stories could handle it a bit better. So that's just one of the many differences I would see.
That's fascinating. And it's definitely a conversation I think we've all had internally, is sort of like, how did the stories get passed down, and
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions that are here with us this afternoon? I mean, I can keep asking Lily questions, but please, if you have any, feel free to jump in. Please, Rachel, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So this is a slightly obscure question, but why and when and why do you think that Paddington Bear
Oh, I love
sort
talking
of
about Paddington Bear.
was, became known as somehow connected to the Kindertransport?
Because okay, it's my favorite topic. So Paddington Bear is inspired by the Kindertransport. So the author saw all these children arriving in England with a sign around their neck that had their names on it. And so that's how he figured he came up with this bear, Paddington Bear, that had a sign around his neck, and he didn't have a name. And so the children in England arrived at Liverpool Street Station, but he had the bear arrive at Paddington Station because the name sounded cuter, like Paddington Bear, and not Liverpool. And so it is 100% a Kindertransport story. It's been taught in my university, where we had a class about like Holocaust movies, and we watched Paddington Bear. So it's he's a Kindertransport story. I love him. Yes.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yes.
Thank you for asking that question, Rachel. Another funny connection to that is that I currently live in Peru, and so Paddington is supposedly from Peru.
Yes.
And there is a Paddington sculpture outside of this mall near where I live, and I've still never
so cute.
The movie or read the books, but now I definitely will.
Yeah, I've seen there's a new book about the Kindertransport, and it has like Paddington on the cover. So there is really this connection, like the Paddington statue. Like, so there is really this connection. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
So yeah, happy to answer obscure questions as well.
I love that.
I have a question. Oh, sorry.
Michelle and then Sophie. Cool.
Thank you. So you can hear me, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So I was wondering, why do you think it's so unknown about the Kindertransports to the US?
I mean, generally, like we didn't know about the Kindertransport until 1989 at all. And that is because, especially with the British Kindertransport, the children didn't realize that they were part of a bigger story, because they didn't know how organized and how big it was. And because they were all then separated, they just didn't recognize the largeness of it. Did we just? Yeah. And it was like then in 1989, when Bertha Leviton, who was like 16 already on the Kindertransport, so she had like a better understanding, she thought, oh, it would be nice to do a 50-year reunion. And she just like put newspaper ads out and thought, yeah, you know, maybe we get 50 people. And 2,000 people came. And overnight, the world learned about the Kindertransport, but also the people themselves, because they hadn't realized how big it is. And so then 89 and 90 is when these Kindertransport survivor organizations are founded in England, America, and Israel. And so that's when everyone learned about it. But then, I mean, for the next 20 years or more, everyone focused on the British Kindertransport because it's so big, and that's what you knew about. And so also the Kindertransport has a bit of a bad record keeping. The Viennese Jewish Archive is the only Jewish archive that survived World War II in a mixture of, it wasn't taken by the Nazis and also it wasn't bombed by the Allied forces accidentally. So all the Kindertransport research originates from Vienna. And so they're just like, hasn't been that much research for a long time, and now it's slowly starting to change. Like, I mean, now the newest book about the Kindertransport is actually critical of it. So we have now reached a point where we're not only telling it as a wonderful story, but we're also looking at how they selected the children, who was allowed to even go, which I didn't talk about, but in Arthur's family, like only the younger Oswald was allowed to go in a Kindertransport, and his older brother was not because he had epilepsy. So we're now talking more about these things and slowly learning more about the other Kindertransports. But I mean, I told you, even like career professional historians researching the Kindertransport have not really heard about this. And in America, it's usually this big storyline of they didn't take anyone in. And I mean, of course, I don't know if you've heard of the Wagner-Rogers bill, which would have been 20,000 children Kindertransport to America. That wasn't even supported by Jewish groups because they were afraid of anti-Semitism. So this is the much larger story. And the Kindertransport to America, here, like, it was never called a Kindertransport in English. I think the German side called it a Kindertransport, but it initially, they were going to evacuate British children from the Blitz. So like our allies, the British, were trying to get their children to America for a short while. And then the first ship that they used to evacuate children, the city of Benares, was sunk by the Germans. And so then none of the British parents wanted to send their children anymore, but they had just organized the whole logistics of it. And Eleanor Roosevelt was very involved in this. And then someone had the idea of several people, including Papanek, who was in America already, kind of said, well, there is this Jewish children, and no one cares if the ship might get bombed by the Germans. It's still going to be safer for them. So then they kind of like switched around, and they got 300 children to America outside of the quota, but still only 300. So yeah. And someone just texted me personally if this is in the book, and yes, most definitely is in the book.
I mean, the 20,000 kids, Congress would not approve of them to come
They
into
didn't even vote on it. It
because-
didn't even come to a vote.
because their attitude was that cute little Jewish children grow up to be ugly Jewish adults.
Yeah, but like I said, it didn't even come to a vote, and it was not supported by Jewish American groups. So lots of people didn't like fight for it. So in total, we say there's an organization that is called the 1,000 Children, and that is the 1,000 unaccompanied children that came to America. Some of them were just put on a boat by their parents and just like sent without supervision, and then ended up in foster care. And then 300 are these children. But so in total, it's just 1,000 kids that make it to America unaccompanied. Yeah.
And what's the organization called? The 1,000 Children?
1,000 Children. It's a survivor organization.
Okay,
I don't know how active they are anymore.
Thank you.
It's really interesting. Sorry, Sophie, before you ask your question, Lily, what you were saying made me think, so I had two cousins who were on the kinder transport from Vienna to London, but then they were supposed to be on the boat that sank and they were not.
Yeah.
And they instead went on the next boat. But I guess if that still happened during the war, they would be considered part of like that 1,000 children.
Probably. Yes.
Huh. Yeah, wow.
Basically, yeah, I mean, these are children that came outside of the quota and without parents.
Yeah, that would be them.
Yeah.
Sophie, go for it.
Thank you. It's hearing you speak about all of this and both the history and also your work and relationship with Arthur is amazing. So thank you so
Thank you.
much for sharing all of this. I'm curious about, and you said that you're currently working on your PhD. So I think this is more of like a personal question about your research now and kind of how your work has changed, evolved,
Yes.
whatever word works. But I guess how has it maybe changed, if it has? And what is your current work looking like in PhD?
Yeah, so I mean, so I wrote Arthur and Lilly before I started writing my PhD. So then my PhD advisor basically forbade me from writing a kindertransport PhD. So my PhD is about Jewish women who rescued Jews. It started in France. So it started out as just women who saved Jews, like female rescuers, because much more women rescued than men, which makes sense if you like pause for a second and think about it. Like a lot of the men were in war or in prisoner of war camps. A lot of rescue came from social work areas that then became more and more illegal. So primarily female professions. And there's also always the argument if it's less dangerous for a woman. So there's many reasons why it's more women. But everyone has seen Schindler's List and has like a very idea in their head of like the male rescuer. And so initially I started out just writing about female rescue. And then as it goes in a PhD, it gets smaller and smaller. So I ended up only doing France. And then I am now only doing Jewish women in France who rescued other Jews. And I have 60 women in my thesis. It is a way too over ambitious thesis, but I'm almost finished. So I'm getting my way through there. And of course, Jewish rescue then is very interesting because it adds all these other dimensions. And it has not been recognized for so long because like the righteous and Yad Vashem, they wanted to show that non-Jews help Jews. And in the process, they kind of forgot at looking at Jews that save Jews. Because it's always often considered like what's like your obligation. But it's actually much more dangerous for Jews to help other Jews. And so, yeah, I talk about all. I can talk about this forever, so just stop me. But yeah, that's my PhD.
Thank you. And congratulations.
Thank you. And I mean, funnily enough, it then touches on the same organizations that saved Arthur. So a lot of the people worked for the same group that saved Arthur, but that's just like coincidentally. Yeah.
Wow. That's fascinating. And yeah, I did notice you do touch on that a little bit in the book too. It's sort of that like the being the fact that really you had to be like a Gentile to be a righteous, but yeah, the sort of because it was considered your responsibility. This is a kind of more of a like a nitty-gritty question, but I know there's many of us who have been doing our own research on our grandparents. And so I'm just curious, like, how did you go about this research beyond, interviews, I imagine, with Arthur? What was your process like? Were there any tools that were particularly helpful?
I mean, yeah, I mean, like I am a trained historian, so I just went to like a lot of archives. I think maybe the things I did that other people didn't do. So one, I traveled to all the places and it gives you such a better understanding. And I'm always surprised that not more historians do this. Like I know historians researching the same topic in Paris, and they've never taken the 20-minute ride to go to one of these homes. And yes, of course, I mean, today, like the one home today is a police station, but still it gives you a better understanding. And you might find things like there is one home where the children in the basement carved their names into the basement.
Yeah.
So there is things to find out there. So that's like, I would say, one of the things I do differently. I interviewed like so many people for the book too. But in terms of archives, I mean, I think if you do research, I mean, maybe if your parents maybe 10 or even 15 years ago tried to do research on their parents versus now, it's become much easier because more time has passed. So archival laws are being like softened. And so, I mean, all the camp data is housed by the International Tracing Service by the Red Cross. And until maybe 5 years ago, they were not allowed to show it to anyone except a direct relative. So you had to like make an inquiry with them. But now, because it's 80 years since the war ended, or 70 years, they're allowed to show these documents. And so they do a lot of like crowdsourcing now, where they have like just random people. Like if you're bored, I do it when I'm bored, you can just like type name lists from camps, and that helps them index. And so you might find much more things than even 5 years ago. And the tracing service, let me put it in the chat, they kind of like have renamed themselves. So they are now called the Arlson Archives, because that's where physically in Germany they are located. But I mean, even like if you think like, oh, I tried with them a couple of years ago, they now have much more things because they're better indexed. So that is one of the things that's really changed. But for example, also like there's a foster care file for Arthur as a Jewish foster child in New York. And they don't even, like it's located in New York at the Center for Jewish History, and they don't even tell you that they have it. So if you haven't heard about it somehow, and then if you are not a direct relative, they will even like acknowledge its existence. So you just kind of like need to be really connected and sometimes coincidentally you find out about these things. Yeah.
1,001 coincidences.
It is really, yeah. I mean, that is how research, I mean, works often. And then you kind of like need to stay tenacious with it. Like I also talk in a book how I was in the New York Public Library in New York where the Papanek papers are. And I don't know if you've ever seen war paper. It's like incredibly thin and it sticks together. And if you're like sitting in an archive for 8 hours and you're just like going like this, I almost missed finding a letter by Oswald's parents to Papanek, because it's like you get tired and you don't look anymore. So you need to like stay sharp and take a lot of breaks.
Yeah.
Which maybe like the best advice I can give.
That's great. On the subject of Papanek, I think you also wrote a book about him,
yes.
right?
So after I wrote Arthur and Lilly, everyone always asked about Papanek. And so I wrote a book about Papanek in German afterwards.
Okay.
So maybe it will make it into English one time. Because just like we can learn so much from his education and from his psychological work for today's situation. I know especially like in Germany or like in Europe when like 6 years ago when we had so many refugees coming, and people felt like we need to reinvent the wheel because no one really stopped to think when was the last time we had so many refugees coming and what did we do with them and maybe what worked and what didn't work. And the Kindertransport is like the perfect 80-year study because you can see the differences in like the perfect long-term study. So no one really paused to look at like what happened back then. So he is really fascinating. I just put his name in the chat because someone asked me for it. But hasn't been much researched about until my book, which is only sorrily in German. But I write about him a lot in Arthur and Lilly too.
And you touched on this a little bit and earlier and also just now, but what are some of those lessons that you feel that we can learn for like how we handle child refugees today?
I think one of the main takeaways is that in most cases, a group housing is less traumatic than individual, like foster families. But also you see another big difference is that the French kindertransport children, they kept their German. Like they definitely learned French. They were not supposed to be isolated, but their teachers were primarily German and Austrian. And so they continue to speak German and they continue to have German classes. Whereas the British children living in foster families and then German being the language of the enemy, like no one kept their German. Where although the kindertransport specifically was meant to be a temporary solution until they would be reunited with their parents. And so in like the 40% of the cases when they were reunited with their parents, the kids didn't speak German anymore. And so they couldn't communicate with their parents. And so, I mean, that's like a huge thing. Like, of course, you need to integrate them, but you need to also allow them to keep their culture in a way that actually it will help them better integrate because they don't feel like it's being robbed by them. But also if there is a chance to reunite them at some point, like you need to make sure that they still kind of communicate with them. And I mean, just when I think about how they like lost children at the Mexican border, like they didn't lose them, but they didn't know who the children were. And they had to like, now there's this year-long process of like DNA testing and all. It's like back with the kindertransport. They just put a sign around their neck and it worked. Like, I mean, no one in the kindertransport lost the identity of a child. I think they were, of course, more motivated to not lose it, but it's not that hard. Like just give them a wristband with their name and you're safe. Especially if they're like babies and don't know their own name.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm also curious, like, as you've been going on this book tour at a time when anti-Semitism was on the rise in the US, like, is there anything that you have just sort of felt like this is an important message for us to sort of like take back, or, what do you think that we can learn? I mean, there's a lot that we can learn from Arthur, but like, I think that we can sort of like take away with us learning from like Arthur and from your relationship with him.
I definitely think it's a totally different book tour than what I had planned and envisioned. Because I mean, what has been like swept under because everyone was so busy, but it is actually 85 years Crystal Night, and it is the 85th anniversary of the kindertransport. And I thought this is what I was going to talk about. And then of course, October 7 brought everything much closer to home for everyone. So I changed the book reading. So the book is the same. But when I read about it, like when I read in Germany, I talk more about the Holocaust. And when I read from it here, I talk more about how Arthur became a happy man and how you kind of like overcome this trauma. And I think, especially speaking at synagogues, this has been what has resonated most with people, where they, especially like when I started the book tour in October, and I would speak at a synagogue and the service would be like oftentimes almost like aggressive, like Israel, like, let's pray for the IDF, let's pray for whatever. And then I spoke about the Holocaust, but people afterwards came and said, this was actually so peaceful and like hopeful, and it gives me another perspective. So it is a Holocaust book, of course, but it's in a way almost uplifting because I don't end in 45. I continue to tell the story of how Arthur became this happy, successful man with this huge family of other former kindertransport children.
Yeah. I think there's something really beautiful in the community aspect of that.
Yeah.
And just sort of like.
Which, also happened for the British kindertransport, but 50 years later. Because now, I mean, since they've learned so much about the kindertransport themselves, I know a lot of people on the British kindertransport, and over 50% of their friends were also on a kindertransport. Because going to these conferences, it started like meeting strangers that had the same story. So it really resonated and it created a lot of friendships. So today, I think all kindertransports are very identity building. Just for the British one, it took 50 more years.
Yeah. I gotta say, it's crazy. Like, I was born in 1990, and so I feel like I've lived my whole life in a time when the Kindertransport was known.
Yeah,
And so
but no
you
one knew
said that
about it
it was
before.
not known until
Yeah.
89. My mind was blown.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
also like uh there's this feeling that a lot of the like camp survivors had to like die of old age before the children could start telling their story. Because at at Holocaust survivor conferences, there was a lot of like looking down on the Kindertransport. Because like, oh, you just had this great time in England and you didn't go to a camp or anything. So they also like they had to become older, and every historian like she writes in her book, a German historian, she says like it's like getting out of the shadow of the Auschwitz survivors, but kind of like most of the Auschwitz survivors had to die for that to be able to happen.
Michelle?
Do you feel like also with England, it was different in the fact that the British saw the Germans as a whole, like, monolith, and they were all the enemies. And at some point, a lot of the German Jews that escaped there were rounded up and, put, on ships, sent away or put in the, like on an island, like in a concentration camp.
I not like, yeah, it was like more like a hotel island, but yeah, they were definitely like taken away. It happened to the older Kindertransport children, like the ones over 16. Didn't happen for a long time, but it did definitely happen, and it had an impact. So we say like of the 10,000 Kindertransport children to England, like half stayed in England after the war, and like a quarter, like 2,500 came to America, and 2,500 came to Israel. And the ones in America and Israel had it easier because it's immigration societies, whereas in England, you're very looked upon if you have an accent. So that has been like a difference in their experiences as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure, you're welcome.
Great. Well, unless anybody else has any other questions, then I would encourage you all to buy and read Lily's book. It's really a fantastic read. And like I said, she has a very unique way of writing, sort of much more journalistic. She takes you on the journey with her, which not to, as the reason I asked you about the what are your resources for research and things is because as I've been reading, I've been thinking like, oh, this is, I could do this differently, or I feel I've been learning from your process.
I mean, yeah, but
journey.
because most of people don't even know like how do you go along that.
Yeah.
So I take them kind of like it's like a detective search.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know where you guys are from. I know it's hosted by 3G Philly and New York. So I'm speaking in Manhattan on Tuesday. It's like the full book reading, not like today. If you're interested in that, it's at Deutsches Haus, and I'm like at a private house in Media close to Philly on Wednesday. They're not posting the address, but if you're interested in coming, you can just like reach out to me over. I'm very easily to find on all the social medias. So also like if you want a signed book, this would be the easiest way, but I can also like send you one if you want. I'm in the States for 8 more days. So like the 8 days of possible book signings. To send from Europe, it's going to be very expensive. It's my own 8 days of Hanukkah.
Yeah.
So I put my email address in the comments, like if you want a book or if you have a question, feel free to reach out. Happy to answer all of that. Yeah. And thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lily.
You've been like one of the youngest crowds I've been speaking to. I mean, I also go to a lot of schools, so not the schools, but if you go like to a voluntary event, people tend to be older.
Yeah. Oh, actually, that reminds me. I saw on your website that you spoke at Stuyvesant, and that's the reason
because Arthur went to Stuyvesant.
And I was just curious, like, how was that? Did the kids respond to this as being like one of their fellow, an alum?
Yeah, I mean, so like Stuyvesant has a Jewish history class, although now they're like 80% Asian kids. But the teacher is so popular, so it's a very popular class, and I think that like I've been to a lot of schools on this book tour. Like I spoke to 250 kids in East Texas. I don't think they ever had any visitor from like outside of Texas. So they all were really excited about it. But Stuyvesant was cute too. They interviewed me for the student paper. Yeah, he was an alumni there. So that was kind of cool.
Cool. Well, enjoy the rest of your Sunday afternoons. Happy
Thank
Hanukkah,
you. Happy
everyone.
Hanukkah.
And we'll see you at our next event.
Bye.
Bye, Lily. Thank you.